going to finish DAF Chav Hey, and then we're going to do Mirz Hashem pretty much all of Chav Vav, even though that's tomorrow's DAF. And we will not have a DAF tomorrow because it's Tisha B'Av, and then we will resume with Wednesday's DAF Chav Zayin. Okay. The Gemara had told us there's a machlokas between Aryai and Rava. And the machlokas between Aryai and Rava is when you're doing something, you're benefiting from something which is Asur Bahana. However, you're doing it Ba'al Korcho. You're doing it against your will. Now, the term against your will is a little bit vague. And so, first of all, the machlokas between Aryai and Rava is Aryai says it's okay, since the benefit is coming to you against your will. And Rava says it's not okay. Now, what do we mean by against your will? Obviously, it can't mean that you're being strapped to a table and being forced to imbibe, because otherwise Rava can't tell you that it's Asur. So what are we talking about? So yesterday, the Gemara had given us one opinion. We talked about a situation where a person it's low efshar, it's not possible, efshar velo michavein, that it's possible for you to avoid the benefit, which means we talked about the example of where you know there's a church down that street, and that's your way to work, and you know that when you walk past there's going to be a beautiful, fragrant smell of Avodah Zarah incense. So your intention is not to benefit from the incense, but it is possible for you to circumvent that street and take a detour. It just happens to be it's not the shortest path. So this is where Aryai says that it's mutter, and we're having this discussion in the Shita of Rabbi Shimon, who says that a davar she'eino miskavein is mutter. That something that you don't have intention of doing is completely permitted. Even though Rabbi Shimon was talking in the context of Shabbos, but the application applies to any Isser Hana as well. So Aryai says that according to Rabbi Shimon it's mutter, and Rava says no, even according to Rabbi Shimon it's going to be Asur, because the only time that Rabbi Shimon says that a davar she'eino miskavein is mutter is when it's efshar, is when that's the only way that you can go. Then we tell you, okay, go to work. We're not going to stop you from going to work. If you have something that you have to do and you have to pass by a hana, so then you're allowed to pass by if that's the only way to do it. But, and it's not your kavana. But if you have a way to get by without going and imbibing that hana, even though it's davar she'eino miskavein, it's still going to be asur. That's the machlokas between Aryai and Rava. The Gemara had established that their machlokas is within the shita of Rabbi Shimon, because according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says that a davar she'eino miskavein is asur, then it doesn't matter whether you have efshar or efshar, it's still going to be asur according to Rabbi Yehuda. That's one way of understanding the whole sugya. Today we're going to examine the alternate way of learning the sugya, and we're going to then analyze each method. The Gemara now says, Ika da Amri, which is about 8 or 9 lines from the bottom. Ika da Amri, Efshar velo michavein hainu pluktayu, the Rabbi Yehuda v'Reb Shimon. So the Gemara says, others learn as follows. When it's possible to circumvent the area that you're going to, and you don't have any kavana of having hana'ah, like you have another way to get to work, and you don't have to walk past this church. So that's the machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Reb Shimon, that Rabbi Yehuda says that it's asur, and Reb Shimon says that it's mutter. Lo efshar velo kami chavein kuli alma lo pligi deshari. In a situation where it's not, there is no other way to go, and you don't have hana'ah, you don't have kavana to be neheneh, so then everyone would agree that that's mutter, because even Rabbi Yehuda would tell you it's perfectly fine. Ki pligi delo efshar v'kami chavein. So the machlokas is just the opposite of what we had said before. In the previous version, we had learned that the machlokas is within Reb Shimon in a case of efshar v'lo mechavein. Here we're suggesting just fakert. We're saying that it's a case of low efshar, there is no alternate route, and v'kami chavein, and even though there's no alternate route, you are excited because I get to go to work every day and walk past the delicious smelling incense of the Avodah Zarah, a gishmak. And maybe I'll tarry a couple of seconds longer as I'm walking past the church. So that's the machlokes. Va'aliba de Reb Shimon da'azul basar kavana kuli alma lo pligi de'asr. And there's a big chiddush over here. Here we're suggesting that Reb Shimon is going to be more machmir than Reb Yehuda, because what is Reb Shimon's whole statement? Reb Shimon says, Davar she'eno miskavein is mutter. Now, what does that tell you? By inference, that Davar hamiskavein is aser. What you see from here is that Reb Shimon's criterion for determining whether an act is permitted or forbidden is based on intent, and not on whether you have other options or not. So that can be taken both l'chumra and l'kula. We use it l'kula to tell you that as long as it's not your kavanah to benefit, it's okay. But l'chumra is that as long as it's your kavanah to benefit, then it's not okay, even when it's efshar, even when there's no other alternative. As long as your kavanah is to be neheneh, you're going to have problems. And kipligi aliba de Reb Yehuda, the Amar lo shna miskavin velo shna she'ein miskavin. So the machlokas is according to Reb Yehuda, who says it doesn't matter. The criterion is not your kavana. The criterion is going to be, and now this is the issue, is the criterion will be what your options are. If you have other options, then you're mechuyev to avoid the yisr. But if you don't have other options, then it makes no difference whether your kavana is to be nehene or not to be nehene. It's going to be permitted. So therefore, that's the position of Abaye. That as long as you have other options, right, then it's going to be usr. And now comes Abaye and says, Rebbe Yehuda. And Abaye says, well, if it's efshar, and according to Rebbe Yehuda, we don't reckon with a person's kavana, we just reckon with whether it's efshar or efshar. So here it's efshar. So the fact that he has kavana is irrelevant, and therefore it's going to be mutter according to Rebbe Yehuda, because it's efshar. There's no other option that I have. And V'Rava Amar Lacha, and Rabbi says no. We never find that Rebbe Yehuda is going to be more makel than Reb Shimon. Ad kan lo ka'amar Rebbe Yehuda she'ein miskavin kemiskavin elo l'chumra. Rebbe Yehuda only tells us that a lack of kavana is like kavana in the sense that you have to be machmir. Aval miskavin kishe'ein miskavin l'kula lo. But we never see that Rebbe Yehuda ever tells us that we can be lenient to tell us that it doesn't make a difference whether you have kavana or not, and we can therefore say that having kavana is just as lenient as not having kavana. That we never find Rebbe Yehuda addressing. So therefore Rava says that according to Rebbe Yehuda, you need one of two things in order to be machmir. You need either that it's efshar or that it's mechaveh. But the only time that we would be lenient according to Rebbe Yehuda, says Rava, if it's efshar velo mechaveh. And Abaye says, no, nothing doing. According to Rebbe Yehuda, kavana is not a factor whatsoever. The sole criterion is efshar versus efshar. If it's efshar, it's aser, and if it's efshar, it's always going to be mutter. And that's the way Abaye is going to stand. Amar Abaye mina aminallah. So Abaye says, how can I prove this to you, that according to Rebbe Yehuda, the sole criterion is efshar versus efshar? The Tanya, Amru Alav al Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, because they testified that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, when he would want to give a shir to the masses who had come for Aliyah L'Regel, they had come to assemble on the Temple Mount, there was really only one place that you could get everyone together. And that happened to be in the shadow of the temple itself. And on hot days, it was a geshmak to sit under the shadow of the walls of the Beis HaMikdash. And here, this was really the only place where you could get people to sit down all together and give them a drasha. And nevertheless, so that's considered to be efshar. There was no other option to get everyone together and give a big drasha. But at the same time, the kavana was to be able to protect yourselves from the shade. And yet you still see that it's mutter. So you see that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is ostensibly going like Rebbe Yehuda, and therefore you see that kavana is irrelevant. As long as it's efshar, it's okay. V'Rava Amar Shaini Heichal Dilatocho Asoy. And Rava says, no, that's not. You see, what's the issue? The issue is that you're not allowed to be neheneh from Kodshim, you're not allowed to be neheneh from the Beis HaMikdash. So the whole right that Rabbi Yochanan had to shield himself with the walls of the Beis HaMikdash must have been because it's not considered to be a prohibited hana'ah, because it's efshar. Rava says no. That's not why it was okay for him to get the shade of the Beis HaMikdash. The reason why he was permitted to get the shade of the Beis HaMikdash is because the exterior of the temple walls are not sanctified. It's only the interior of the walls of the temple are sanctified that you cannot get benefit from. But the exterior of the walls are bichlal not sanctified, which, by the way, is a fascinating discussion, because that has to do with can I stick my kvittel into the kaisel or not? Maybe, I'm not sure, but it's just something to consider. Okay, anyway, Amar Rava, Mina Aminala. So Rava now says, where can I prove to you that for Rebbe Yehuda you use one of either criteria? In other words, either it's efshir is going to make it usher, or it's kamechavin is going to make it usher. So ditnan lulin hayu pesuchin ba'aliyas beis kodshei hakodshim shebahen mishalshalin es ha'umnim b'tevos kedosh lo yazunu eineihem mi beis kodshei hakodshim. That the Mishnah describes how there were skylights in the Holy of Holies. And these skylights, or this skylight that was in the Holy of Holies, would allow a worker to be descended by a rappelling. Is that what it's called? Mm-hmm. He would rappel down, like Batman. He'd come down like a worker coming down the rope, and then he would be able to do whatever repairs were necessary in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. But that was not enough. They put him in a box with just a slit for him to be able to work from. Why? Because it was not permitted for him to benefit visually from seeing the objects, the beautiful objects in the Holy of Holies. So the Gemara now says, "V'hahacha delo efshir v'kamichavin v'aser." So Rava says, this is the only way that you can do repairs in the Beis HaMikdash is by accessing the temple, and yet the rabbi still restricted you from getting any hana'ah of vision. And so you see that even when it's efshir, as long as you're machavin, it's going to be usher. This proves my point, says Rava.
When it came to the Beis HaMikdash, just to see the beauty of the Beis HaMikdash, that would be a problem?
Perhaps. 1 second. We're going to talk about it in just a second. Frek the Gemara v'tispera. Does this make any sense? The ha'amar Reb Shimon ben Pazi, amar Reb Yeshua ben Levi mishum bar kapara, kol umara v'reach ein b'hem mishum me'ila. 1 second. We know that there's a halacha that sound, sight, and smell are not subject to the laws of me'ila, of being nehenev, of getting benefit from temple property, is not subject to the benefits of sound, sight, and smell. So even if a person were to imbibe visually all of the beauty of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, there's no me'ila there, so what's the big deal? So obviously the concern is not so much that a person is being nehene in the formal halachic sense from the visual beauty of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, elamayla asu bebeis kodshei hakodshim. But rather you must conclude that this was a special chumrah that the rabbis placed upon the sites of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Meaning, in reality, we'll tell you that Abaya is correct, that because it's efshir, his kavana is irrelevant, and it's permitted for him to be nehene. However, the reason why they restricted him by putting him in a box is because of a special chumrah that applies only in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, but not in the sense of me'ila, but just as a special additional safeguard. Ika da Amri, others learned the whole discussion backwards. Amar Rava mina aminallah. Rava says, I can prove my point from this follows. Detanya, Amar Reb Shimon ben Pazi, Amar Reb Yeshua ben Levi mishum bar kapara, kol umara v'reach ein bohem mishum me'ila. Because what did bar kapara say? He said that sound, sight, and smell are not subject to the laws of me'ila. Now, what does that tell you? You can make an inference from that. Me'ila hu deleka ha'isura ika. So you see, there's no formal me'ila such that you'd have to bring a korban. But it sounds like from that statement that the only thing that there is not is actual me'ila, but in Isser still there would be. So Rava wants to prove from that very statement of Bar Kapara the fact that it is usher from a person being lowered into the Kodesh HaKadoshim to get any, or actually from the statement of Bar Kapara by itself, the very fact that he acknowledges that there's still an Isser, even when it's efshir, as long as you're mechavein, right? My lavla osen home dem bifnim. So that statement must be addressing people who are inside the Beis HaMikdash. They've come to bring a korban, or they've come to do the avoda. And even though there's no way to avoid the hana'ah, because you're there and you're smelling and you're hearing the Levium play their beautiful music and you see the beautiful carvings and artwork and construction of the Beis HaMikdash. As long as you have kavana to be nehena, it's going to be aser. According to this, the Gemara is right. So the Gemara says no, delo efshor kamichavin va'aser. So this proves Rava's point. So the Gemara says no, lo laosen ha'omdim b'chutz. No, it's only referring to the people who are standing outside the Beis HaMikdash and are hearing, seeing, or smelling. Those are the people, the Gemara says, are not allowed to have hana'ah, gratuitous hana'ah. Why are they not allowed to get gratuitous hana'ah from the sights and the sounds and the smells of the Beis HaMikdash? Because for them it's efshir. They don't have to get up so close to the temple because they're not doing anything inside. For the people who are inside, I'll tell you, it's like abaya. Since it's efshir, it's mutter. But it's only the people outside that it's efshir. They can distance themselves from the temple. They don't have to get up so close to hear or smell or see. Those are the people that we say they're not allowed to get hana. What the Gemara seems to be maintaining at this point, to just address Shlomi's point, is that a person, even according to Abaye, would not be allowed to just stand outside the Beis HaMikdash and listen to the Levium's beautiful music. Let's say he loves the smell of burning karbanos. It's like smelling a barbecue.
Or the incense.
Yeah, you wouldn't, or the incense. Sounds like you wouldn't be allowed to just stand there and smell it because you're getting gratuitous hana'ah from that which is sacrificial and holy. So that's what it sounds like from the Gemara. So tzarachian, how do we deal with that? Anyway, Gufa, let's go and analyze this whole halacha. Amar Reb Shimon ben Pazi, Amar Reb Yeshua ben Levi, Mishum bar kapara, Kol umara v'reach ein ba mishum me'ila, that sound, sight, and smell are not subject to me'ila. So the Gemara now says, let's question that. V'reach ein bo mishum me'ila. Since when is smell not subject to me'ila? V'hatanya ha'mefatem es ha'ketores l'hisat lamed ba. Olamosra l'tzibur pater. We have a halacha that states as follows. If a person manufactures ketores, and his objective in manufacturing ketores is in order to train himself to be a professional ketores manufacturer, or if his objective in manufacturing ketores is in order to donate it to the Beis HaMikdash, so then he's not doing an iser. However, if he manufactures the ketores lahariach ba chayiv, then he's actually going to be chayiv kares, because the Torah says explicitly that anyone who manufactures ketores for the purpose of using it for personal use is chayiv kares. V'hameriach ba'pater ela shema'ah. And if a person did not manufacture it, but just decides to smell it, he goes over to his friend's house who just manufactured ketores and starts burning it himself and starts enjoying the smell, he's not chayiv kares, because only the manufacturer is chayiv kares, but he is liable for me'ila. So you see that smell is subject to me'ila. So the Gemara says, Ela Amar Rav Papa, you have to modify Bar Kapara's statement. Kol umare ein bahem mishum me'ila lefi she'ein bahem mamish. Sound and sight benefits, those are always not subject to me'ila because there's nothing significant enough to be able to tell you that you got a direct hana'ah. However, v'reach la'acher shetala tamruso ein bo mishum me'ila hol v'naseis mitzvaso. When it comes to smells, then it depends. If you're smelling the incense before it's incinerated and the cloud of incense has risen from the incense, so then it's usher, then you're liable for me'ila. But if you're only imbibing the smell after the cloud has risen from the burning incense, and then you're smelling the residual smell of that burning incense, then it's okay. Why? Because once the mitzvah is done, the ketores that you're smelling is no longer litzorech gavoa. It's no longer in the service, used in the service of God, and therefore it's no longer has that kedusha that would prevent you from smelling it and making you liable for me'ila. So the Gemara now says, okay, fine. Lememra dechol hecha denases mitzvaso ein bo bishum me'ila. Are you suggesting that any time you're imbibing a benefit from something where the mitzvah was already done, there's no law of me'ila? What about the Trumas Hadeshen? Anyone know what the Trumas Hadeshen is? Yeah. You take a shovel full of ash every morning off the Mizbeach and you place it on the side of the Kevesh, and you're supposed to leave it there, and no one is allowed to benefit from that. It's asur bahana. So the Gemara says, "Dichsiv v'samo eitzel hamizbech shelo yefazer v'samo shelo yehana." And we learn from the psukim that you have to place it on the side of the mizbeach. That word v'samo, you place it, teaches me that it has to be accumulated. It can't be scattered, and also that you have to place it next to the mizbeach teaches me that it has to be precluded from human use. So you see that even after the mitzvah was done, because it's now carbonized items that were already used to perform the mitzvah of the mizbeach, and yet you're still not allowed to get hana from it. Why is it any different from already burnt ketores? The Gemara says, "Mishum dahavu trumas hadesh and ovigdei kahuna shnei ksuvim haboim ke'echad v'chol shnei ksuvim haboim ke'echad ein melamdin." Answers the Gemara because we have two source texts which tell us that even after the mitzvah was performed, you're not allowed to get hana'ah. Normally, when we have one pasuk that teaches us a principle, we say that that principle not only applies to that one case, but it applies, we call that a binyanav, and we apply it to kol haTorah kula. But when we have two psukim that teach me the same halacha, then the hermeneutic principles tell us that we only apply that law to those two cases to the exclusion of kol haTorah kula, to the exclusion of all other areas. So here we have two cases in the Torah which tell me that I'm not allowed to benefit even after the mitzvah is done, and from there we infer that everywhere else in the Torah you are allowed to benefit after the mitzvah was done. What are the two cases? One is Trumas Hadeshen, as we just mentioned, and the other one is Bigdei Kahuna, the Kohanic vestments after Yom Kippur, as we'll see in just a moment. Trumas Hadeshen Hada Amran, we just mentioned the Trumas Hadeshen. Bigdei Kahuna Dichsiv V'hinicham Sham. That on Motzei Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol takes off his vestments and he places them into Geniza. Malame Shetudin Geniza. So this teaches me that in only those two cases is there an Isser Hana even after the mitzvah is done, but by all other places, Hana is mutter.
Can you apply that to the church incense? Once their mitzvah is done, it's no longer considered.
That's an interesting question as far as the church incense. I'm not sure. So the Gemara now says, oh no, he's saying maybe after the Avodah Zarah was done. You know, it's there should be some parallel. It's an interesting question. So the Gemara now says that'll all work out well, that if you learn that the words Vihini Cham Sham, he shall place the vestments there, teaches me that they're permanently Asur Bahana. Elul Rabbi Dosa the Poligalayhu the Amar Aval Ru'uyin Hein Lakoin Hedjot Umay Vihini Cham Sham Shal Ishtamish Bahem B'Yom Kippurim Acher Ma'ikal Ameimar. But Rabbi Dosa disagrees. Rabbi Dosa says that the vestments are not Asur Ba'ana. A regular Kohen is allowed to use those white vestments in his normal Kohanic responsibilities. All Vihini Cham Sham teaches me is that you may not use these vestments for any future Yom Kippur service, but for a regular service you are allowed to use them. So now you only have one pasuk which teaches you an Isser Hana after the mitzvah was done. Where's the second pasuk? So the Gemara answers, I'll show you a second pasuk. Mishum dahavu trumas hadeshen ve'egla arufa shnei ksuvim haboim ka'echad v'chol shnei ksuvim haboim ka'echad ein melamdin. The answer is I have another source. It's from the egla arufa. The egla arufa is such that after you break the calf's neck in the valley, you're supposed to not benefit at all from the calf, even though the mitzvah was done. So now I still have two source texts which teach me this halacha, such that it only applies to those two cases and not to anywhere else in the Torah. So now the Gemara says, but wait a minute, this whole discussion of whether or not you can learn from two texts in the Torah to apply it to Kol HaTorah Kula is in itself a machlokes. We're only going according to the opinion that says when you can identify two texts, then you cannot apply that law to the rest of the Torah. But there's another opinion that says that even with two texts, you can apply that principle to Kol HaTorah Kula. So why don't we say by all other mitzvahs that there's an Isser Hana once the mitzvah has been done? Trei mi'ute ksivi. The Gemara answers because with these two mitzvahs, the mitzvah of Trumas Hadeshen and the mitzvah of Egla Arufa, there's text in those psukim themselves to indicate that the halacha only applies to them. By the Trumas Hadeshen it says he shall place it. It is a miyut that this Isser Hana only applies to Trumas Hadeshen, and for the Arufa it says ha egla ha Arufa, the calf that it's or that it is the one whose neck is broken, which is in itself is a miyut to teach you that only the egla arufa has this special status of being aser bahana even after the mitzvah was done. Now, that concludes our discussion about smells in the Beis HaMikdash. But now we got to go back to Abai and Rava. Remember, Abai and Rava have this machlokes, at least according to this version, as to whether it's when it's efshir v'kam mechavein. According to Rabbi Yehuda, if it's efshir v'kam mechavein, Abai says it's mutter, and Rava says it's aser. So Tashma, Hichnisa l'Rivka v'dasha keshera b'shvil shetinok v'tidosh pesula. There's an interesting brisa which tells me as follows. I have an egla arufa. Now, there are two animals for whom the criteria for their kashrus to be used for the mitzvah is that you can never work the animal at all. What are those two cases? One is egla arufa, and the other one is paraduma. That's precisely correct, right? So, by these two animals, you have to make sure that no work is done with the animal. So let's take a look. The brisa, in talking about the egla arufa, says that if you bring an egla arufa and you bind it to a group of animals, and the reason why you're doing that is not for work purposes. So you brought it, and then the animal on its own ends up trampling over wheat and actually helping you thresh the wheat. The animal is still kosher because, why? Because that was not your objective. However, bishvil shetinok v'tidosh pesula. If, however, your objective when you bound the animal to other animals was that it should nurse from its mother and that it should trample on wheat, so then it's going to be puzzle. So frek the Gemara v'hahacha delo efshir v'kamichaveinu katani pesula. Now over here, this is considered to be like Rashi says, v'hacha lo efshir shelo yachnisena shetinok v'chi miskaven shetinok v'tidosh pesula. So over here it's efshir, meaning that you're binding the animal to its mother so that the animal will be able to nurse, but at the same time you're kamechave, you're having kavana that you wanted to trample on the wheat. So here you have an example of efshir v'kamechavein, and we see a proof to Rava that it's aser. So you see that. So the Gemara says it's a proof to Rava kasha to Abaya. The Gemara says shiny hasam dichsiv asher lo ubad ba mikol makom. He says, the Gemara says, because there's a pasuk that's written by the Egla Arufa that says that the animal may not have been worked whatsoever, even though normally efshir v'kam mechavein is mutter, but over here, because the Torah gives you a special clause that it may not have been worked at all, it's absolutely, the animal is puzzle, even though normally efshir v'kam mechavein is mutter. So frek the Gemara ihachi afilu reisha. Well, if that's the case, then even in the first case, where it's not your kavana that the animal should trample on the wheat, the animal should still be aser, even though it wasn't your kavana, if you have this unconditional pasuk. The Gemara answers, ha lo damya elo laha. The Gemara says, no, what the pasuk is telling you is the following halacha. Because, and we have a similar clause written by the paraduma. Shachan aleha rather of keshera, Allah aleha zachar pesulav. In the laws of para aduma, the Mishnah says that if a bird rests on the back of a para aduma, the para aduma is still kosher. It's not considered to have worked by carrying a bird on its back. However, if it is mounted by a male bull for cohabitation purposes, the para aduma is now puzzle as a para aduma. So my time, what's the reason? We're going to apply this to the Egla Rufa. Amar Rav Papa iksiv avad v'karinan avad ad avid ba'ihu. Then you see, the reason is because when the Torah talks about asher lo ubad ba, that the animal was not worked, it's written in the passive conjugation. But at the same time, it's written without the vav, so that you could also look. The spelling of it looks like avad in the active conjugation. So if the Torah had written avad and we would read it as avad, meaning ayin beis dalet, and we would read it ayin beis dalet avad, so then the halacha would be is that until you actively work the animal yourself, the animal is kosher. Iksiv ubad v'karinan ubad afilu memela nami. If the Torah would have said ubad and it would have been written with the vav, then that would imply that even if a bird rests on its back, it's going to be puzzled because it was even though it wasn't your intention, the animal was worked. But hashlu dichsiv avad v'karinan ubad dumya de avad ma avad denichale af ubad denichale. So the Gemara now says we learn from the pasuk that it's pronounced ubad, but it's spelled avad. So that even though you're not actively involved with working the animal, as long as an activity is done with this cow, such that under normal circumstances you would want that cow to be engaged in that work, so then it's usr. But if the such as being mounted by a male, but if a bird rests on its back, that's not something that an animal owner wants. It doesn't want his animal to be a bird transporter, and so as a result, that's not something that the Torah apostles for this particular animal. So both by the paraduma and the egla arufa, we learn based on the pasuk that even though you didn't actively work the animal, meaning that you bound it to its mother not so that it should trample, but that you're happy that it's trampling, it's something that you're happy with, so then it's going to be pasul. But if the animal was bound to another animal and it was never your kavana, it was never your desire for the animal to be trampling on the wheat, so then the animal is still kosher. And that's all based upon the psukim, but once again, you cannot prove the machlokus between Abaye and Rava. Toshma, Aveda lo yishtachena lo al gabi mita v'lo al gabi magod litzarcho, avol shotcha litzarcha al gabi mita ve'al gabi magod. Now let's look at another halacha. This brisa is talking about the law of hashavas aveda. We know that if I find an object of value, I have to return it to its owner. And I have to also preserve it while it's in my possession. Let's say I find a beautiful silk piece of fabric that has beautiful artwork on it. So if I place it on my bed or on my shelf in order for myself to benefit from it, then that's prohibited, because you're not allowed to benefit from the mitzvah. You have to just preserve it for the owner. But if I'm placing it on the bed or on a shelf to preserve the fabric so that it shouldn't be lying on my dusty floor and getting trampled, so then it's mutter to lay it on my bed, even if a byproduct of laying it on my bed is that I get to look at something nice. However, nizdamnu lo orchin lo yishtachena lo al gabi mita v'lo al gabi magod bein litzarcha bein litzarcho. If, however, I'm having guests over the house and they're going to see this beautiful tapestry laying on my shelf in my dining room, then it's going to be usher, even if I need to place it on the shelf for the preservation of the object. So what do you see from here? Even though it's efshar, even though there's no other way for me to place it on the shelf, but my kavana is specifically that everyone should see the beautiful fabric that I have in my home. People should think that I'm such a macher because I have such a beautiful piece of fabric in my silk fabric in my house. You still see that it's usher. So this is once again a raya to Rava that efshar v'kol mechavein is usher. The Gemara says no. Shiny hasam dekolila imishum einabisha imishum ganavi. The Gemara says no. That's not the reason because of efshar v'kol mechavein. The reason why I'm not allowed to display it in front of my guests is because I will not be able to properly fulfill the mitzvah of hashavas aveda if I do that. Because there's a general rule that when you put something out that's the source of envy, you put it in front of guests, one of two things is going to happen. Either they're going to give it an ayin hara, and that'll cause the object to get damaged, or one of your guests will end up stealing it. And you're going to be tempting fate, essentially, by laying it out in public. That's why the halacha is that you can't display it publicly, because you have an obligation to make sure that it gets safely back to the owner. But it's got nothing to do with the efshar v'kol mechavein. Tashma. Let's look now at another brisa. Mochre ksus mochrin kedarkon uvilvad shelo yiskavein b'chama b'pnei hachama uvikshamim b'pnei hageshamim. This brisa is talking about people who sell shatnez garments. Now, you're not allowed to sell a shatnez garment to a yid, but you're certainly allowed to sell a shatnez garment to a non-Jew. And therefore, if I'm working in a non-Jewish part of town, it's perfectly fine for me to sell shatnez garments. However, since I'm an itinerant salesman and I'm walking around the marketplace, how am I supposed to carry my merchandise? It was very common for a garment merchant to be wearing the garments that he was selling. So it is permitted for me to drape the shatnez garments over my body when I'm selling them, provided that my kavana is not to either get shade from the sun or to get warmth from the cold. So v'hatznuin mafshilim lachureim b'makel. And people who are tsanua, people who want to be extra machmir, will take a stick and hang the garments by a stick so as not to have the shatnez touch them directly. So the Gemara says, one second, V'hahacha de'ef shalamevad kitznuan v'chilo michavin shari. So the Gemara says, one second, here we're talking about a case where it's efsher. It is possible for you to avoid dahana, right? Because you could always put the garment on a stick. And we're talking about when a person, as long as you're not mechavein, as long as you don't have hana, kavana to have hana from the garment, then we say that it's permitted. So remember, let's go back now to the first version of the machlokus between Abai and Rava. Up until now, we've been learning about the second version of the machlokus, where we said the machlokus between Abai and Rava, where it was e efsher v'kam mechavein. But the first version of the machlokus that we started today with was that the machlokus was within Reb Shimon in a case of efsher. You have a way of circumventing the hana, but velo mechavein, but you're not having kavana. And there Abai says it's mutter, and Rava says that it's aser. Now over here, the Brisa clearly says that in such a situation it's mutter. Tiyufta laman damastin l'shna kama derava tiyufta. And therefore this is a refutation according to the first version of the machlokus, because according to this, Rava is completely blown out of the water. And the Gemara says, you're right, this is a tiyufta to the first version. This is a case of efsher. There is an alternate method of you could avoid the hana if you want to, and yet you're not mechavin, and therefore Abaye says it's mutter, very consistent with this brisa, but according to Rav, it's a tiyufta. Do you still want to ask a question?
Yeah, you have to own a garment to be mechayev shatnez. Like, for instance, you go to a store to buy a jacket. A lot of times...
No, it's got nothing to do with ownership. It's an issue of lo yale alecha.
How do you ever try on a jacket?
You're assuming there's a chazaka that most garments, or rove, you're assuming on a rove, that most garments are not shatnez. If, however, you happen to know that there's a certain brand of suit, that a high percentage of those suits are shatnez, and you're not even allowed to try them on. Okay, let's go on. The Mishnah had said that once the beginning of the 6th hour arrives, you're not allowed to use chametz. Even though you're burning the chametz, you're not allowed to use it as fuel to cook with at the same time when you're doing your beer chametz. You can't cook a soup over your beer chametz, right? That's what we had learned in the Mishnah. Tanu Rabbana. Now let's talk about it, and we're going to finish with this today to get up to the top of Chav Zayin. The Brisa now says, Tanur shehisiko beklipe orla o bekashin shel kilei hakeren. You have an oven. The fuel that is being used in the oven is aser bahana. It's either the shells from a nut tree, the nut shells from an orla tree, or it's the wheat chaff that grew as kilayim in a vineyard. These two items are aser bahana, and yet you use them to burn, to heat up your oven. Now, the first time you use an earthenware oven, I forget what the exact word is, but you temper, just like you temper steel with heat, you temper earthenware by burning it for the first time to give it its tempered nature, that it becomes hardened. What's that called?
I don't know. I think it's green.
Okay, you'll think about it. Get back to us.
I'll get back to you.
So the Brisa says Chadash Yutatz Yashan Yutzan. So if it is a new oven that you're using for the first time, so you're tempering the walls of the oven through the burning of this Isser Hana'ah, so then the entire oven becomes Asr because it was manufactured through an Isser Hana'ah, and therefore you have to break the oven. If, however, the oven had already been used and tempered already, so therefore the burning of this fuel does not help to manufacture the oven, so then all you have to do in order to use the oven in the future is let it cool off and then restart the heat from a permissible fuel source. Afabo es hapas, what if I bake bread with this forbidden fuel? So then there's a machlokes. Rabbi Omar hapas asura, the Chachamim omrim hapas muteris. Rabbi says the bread is asur because it was baked through a forbidden fuel, and the Chachamim say the bread is permitted. And the reason why we'll see in just a moment why the Chachamim say the bread is permitted is because the energy that is created as a result of the burning of the forbidden fuel is only created at the time of the destruction of that forbidden substance. It is through the destruction of that forbidden substance that the energy is created, so therefore the energy is not a direct byproduct of the forbidden substance, it's a byproduct of the destruction of the forbidden substance, and therefore the energy that is manifest in this baked bread is not a direct result of the Yisr Hana'ah. So the Gemara now says, Bishal al-gabi gecholim divrei hakol mutter. If you bake the bread on coals from the forbidden substance, which means the forbidden substance has already been carbonized. So therefore its heat that's emanating from these coals is not coming from a forbidden substance directly because it's now completely changed. It's no longer the original forbidden substance. Then even Rabbi holds that it's permitted in that case. Frek the Gemara v'hatanya ben chadosh ben yashan yutzan. Now we have a brisa to contradict that. There's another brisa that says that it makes no difference whether the oven is new or old. Even if you're tempering the oven for the first time, the oven does not have to be broken, it just has to be cooled off and you can continue using it. Lo kasha harebi v'harabana. So the Gemara says, well, it's the same machlokas by the bread. Just like Rebbe holds that the bread is mutter when it's, the Chachamim hold that the bread is mutter when it's baked from a forbidden substance, so too the oven is being tempered by a forbidden substance through its combustion, and therefore it's going to be permitted. But Rebbe will hold that the oven, in both cases, the oven is going to be forbidden if it's being tempered by the forbidden fuel. The Gemara says, but wait a minute. Eimer deshamas le Rebbe mishum deyeshevach eitzim bepas, but zev zegore mishamas le. The Gemara says, but wait a minute. All you see from that first brisa is that Rebbe forbids the bread that was baked as a result of a forbidden fuel. That the energy created from that forbidden fuel is a direct result of the forbidden substance. And he says, yeshevach eitzim bepas, that the accrued value of the bread that is a result of the energy from the wood associates the wood, the firewood, directly to the bread. But over here, why should Rebbe say that the oven has to be broken? L'chora, that doesn't make any sense, because here, if let's say the oven was tempered through a forbidden fuel, but now when I'm going to be baking again in this oven that was tempered through forbidden fuel, there's new fuel that's permitted that's going to be the responsible and contributing to the baking of the bread, and it's only the forbidden fuel which contributes to that together with the permitted fuel. Where do you ever see that when you have two types of fuel that contribute to the effective baking of a bread, that since one of them is a contributing substance, it acts as to forbid everything? All you see from the case of Rebbe with the baked bread that it's usher is when the forbidden fuel is the sole energy source or the sole thing responsible for the baking of the bread, then it's usher. But where do you see when you have two things, both the oven that was hardened through the forbidden fuel plus new fuel which is now permitted? Why would you say that according to Rebbe that would also forbid any future bread from being permitted? So the Gemara says you're right, that it's not Rebbe. Elalo kasha ha Rebbe Eliezer ha Rabbana. The answer is Rebbe Eliezer holds that an oven that was tempered through a forbidden fuel makes the oven permanently forbidden. So the Gemara now asks, hey Rebbe Eliezer, which Rebbe Eliezer are you referring to? Ilema Rebbe Eliezer dis-so'or, maybe it's Rebbe Eliezer who talks about yeast. Ditnan so'or shel chulin v'shel truma shenaflu l'toch isa. We have a Mishnah that says that if you have yeast, you have two different kinds of yeast. One is chulin yeast and one is truma yeast. Both yeasts fell into a dough, but in very small measure, such that neither yeast by itself is sufficient to leaven the dough. But when you combine the two yeasts, you have enough to leaven the dough. So in that situation, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer says, you look at the last yeast that was added to the dough. If the last yeast was chulin, then the dough is chulin. If the last yeast was truma, so then you deal with the dough as truma. V'chachamim omrim bein shenafel iser lechatchila bein shenafel iser lebasof la'olam eino oser. And the chachamim say no. Since the truma yeast by itself is not sufficient to leaven the dough, then you don't look at this at all as truma, as being sanctified, regardless of which yeast was put first and which yeast was put in second. Ad sheyebo kedei lahachmitz, unless you have enough truma yeast independently to leaven the dough, and in which case the whole dough is considered to be truma. Va'amar Abaya lo shanu ela shekadam v'silek esa iser. Abaya clarified Rabbi Eliezer. The only time Rabbi Eliezer says you go after the last dough is if you put in the iser first, and then after you took out the iser, you put in the permitted yeast. Avolo kadam v'silek esa iser aser. But if, let's say, you put in the aser yeast, you put in the truma yeast in first, and you left it in there, and then you put in the chulin yeast, then even though the chulin yeast was second, we still have to reckon with the truma yeast, and we render everything to be truma. So what you see from here is alma zeves gorem aser. So you see that according to Rabbi Eliezer, when you have two substances, one is permitted and one is prohibited, and they both contribute to the formation of a product, then that product is usher, even though only one of the two things that contributed to its formation is usher and the other one is mutter. In the same vein, we want to suggest that according to Rabbi Eliezer, the original fuel which tempered the oven comes from a forbidden substance, but even though you're using new fuel which is permitted, since both the old fuel which is prohibited together with the new fuel which is permitted contribute to the baking of the bread is nevertheless going to be aser. But according to the Chachamim, since one of the two is mutter, we say zeh v'zeh gorem is mutter. You have a wonderful day.